watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
A very good morning to you. It is Saturday, the 13th of June, 2026. This is the Saturday Breakfast Show here on Teachers Talk Radio with me, your host, Darren Lester. How are you doing? How are we? I'm okay. I can't believe that it's the 13th of June already. It has been a fortnight, I would say. I said this to one of my pupils in a lesson yesterday because it had been about 2 weeks since this particular pupil had last had a lesson. It has been a fortnight that has been both really, really long and really, really short. And so I don't know how I feel about it being the 13th of June already. It seems like it should be further on. I feel like we should be around the 20th. But at the same time, it feels like June has only just kind of gotten going. I suppose because it's a short calendar month with only 30 days, it always feels like it's over before it's begun, does June. I do have, despite my hatred of the summer, which is well publicized on the show, I do have a special place in my heart for June. It's my birthday month, if we're going to go all influencer for a second. Not that I celebrate for the whole month. I barely even celebrate for the whole day, if I'm very honest, because as a teacher, June isn't the best time of year to have a birthday, I must say. Pretty much guaranteed to work. I think in my whole kind of career so far, I've only been off for 1 or 2 birthdays, and that even includes the ones that have been on weekends. And then when I was at school, actually, to be fair, when I was at school, I didn't go on my birthday for a long time. I remember my first school birthday because it stood out to me as being weird that I was going to school. And that was when I was in year 2. And I remember that birthday really, really clearly. I remember the presents that I got. In fact, I'm looking at one right now. I remember being in assembly because my school, like most infant schools still do, we kind of had a little period in Friday assembly where everybody who had a birthday that week would come up and sort of say how old they were. So I remember doing that. Yeah, I remember that day very clearly, I think, because it was so unusual in the fact that I had to go to school. And I've been to school on my birthday ever since. So, yes, it's I don't recommend, if you are an aspiring or a trainee teacher with a June birthday, do not recommend. But my birthday is at the beginning. It was a while ago now. So, you know, I'm over my bitterness about it. But that's why June is quite special to me. But other than that, I'm going to be very honest. Today, I have really struggled to get going. I don't know what it is about today. I don't know whether it's because we are now a couple of weeks in since half term. You know, my birthday has come and gone. So that kind of the mental energy that I was putting towards thinking about that is now over. It's been quite a heavy week of lessons. We had our last exam in Latin on Thursday, and so I spent a lot of the beginning of this week doing last minute tutorials, marking last minute past papers that were coming in, doing a lot of reassurance, all of that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden it ended. And Thursday was a very odd day where I had no lessons. It was great because I was able to get lots of office stuff done, but I had no lessons. And then yesterday I just had the one and was able to do a lot of office stuff. So kind of getting into the new routine of not having my year 11s and my year 13s anymore, and kind of thinking about what my days are going to look like now that they've gone is always a bit of a jolt. And yeah, I don't know, maybe that just the kind of sudden stop of the exam stress, like we've been talking about over the past few weeks on the show, maybe that did something. But I could not get out of bed this morning. It was a real struggle. I'm hoping, because I've got quite a lot to do today, I'm hoping the rest of the day is going to go quite smoothly. But we will see. We will see. The topic of today's show is observation. And I want to talk about how much observation we think might be too much. Because as a profession, we are constantly observed. We may not think about it. We may just be so used to the fact that it's, part of our job, that it just becomes background noise in the day to day. But we are under constant observation. We are observed by our young people. That's the whole point of our profession, is to be observed by our young people. And they are very quick, particularly as they get older, they are very quick to make judgments about their perception of the quality of our teaching. And a lot of young people, especially these days, are not scared to make their view known. We are observed by parents quite often. I like to tell the story of a parent last year. So I work at an online school, in case you've never tuned into the show before. And a parent on results day last year emailed me to confess that she had actually been sitting in on lessons that I'd had with her child, and had taken the exam. She'd taken the Latin GCSE, and got a 9. So, I was very proud of that. But in my case, parents are kind of like we knew they were during COVID. Parents are sitting in on lessons quite a lot. And even if you work in a brick and mortar school, so it's harder for the parents to physically come in and sit in your classroom, they are kind of faux observing, I guess, quasi observing, because they are hearing what their children have to say about our teaching, about the lessons that they have sat through, and they are making judgments on it. Those of us who work with a TA, so maybe you're a primary teacher, maybe you are a teacher of a class where one or more of your children have specialist one-to-one provision. We're being observed by those people, by your TA, by the SEN teacher, by whoever it may be. And those are really nice, I must say. I never felt judged by my TA when I was a primary school teacher. I never felt judged by my TA. I always loved having a TA. And then, of course, we've got learning walks. We've got formal observations as part of our performance management strategy. We've got observations because we don't really know why. People just decide that they're going to turn up to our classroom. We've got student teachers who come in to watch our lessons. We kind of work in a bit of a fishbowl, really, in terms of the number of people who physically see us performing our jobs on a day-to-day basis. We are this might be a bit controversial to say, and I'm not sure, because I've actually, just as I was speaking, changed my mind about my perspective on this. I don't think that we are necessarily any more frequently observed than other professions, because I think, the person who is behind the till at the supermarket, however many hundreds of people might go through her till that day, are all observing her work. The doctor, the GP at my local surgery, however many patients she has per day, are observing her work. Yes, they are directly benefiting from it, but it still counts, I suppose, if I'm saying that teachers are observed by our pupils. So I think the nature of work, the nature of performing work in our society is one of observation, because the whole point of working is that you are doing something to contribute to benefit society at large. And so if you're kind of not interacting with society in your work, are you performing a service that is beneficial? So there is that aspect to it. There is the fact that observation, by definition of being watched performing what you're doing, is a very natural part of just the capitalism and the working society that we have. So what I'm particularly interested in talking about today is the kind of psychological toll that observation takes. And of course, focused on teachers because we are Teachers Talk Radio. But as I've kind of just talked myself into, this might be something that is worthy of a bit of a wider conversation in all industries about how we are observed performing our work, why it is necessary to be observed performing our work, because it is, because again, we kind of work and function in very public spheres, and what workers can do to kind of protect ourselves from those negative feelings of judgment that can arise if a lot of your identity is wrapped up in your profession, and if your observation doesn't go as well as it might have done.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week say that almost one half of struggling academy trusts, censured by ministers after registering losses of up to several £1 million, have continued their financial slide. The investigation by Schools Week has found that reserves have dwindled and balances have slipped further into the red, with 3 having deficits of more than 1 million since they were issued with government notices to improve. The article goes on to say that school leaders have warned that more NTIs could be in the offing as funding for schools continues to be squeezed, alongside falling rolls for many. More details on Schools Week. The Financial Times says private schools in England lost 20,000 pupils in the first full year of VAT on fees. The article says the drop in numbers is faster than the falling rolls in the state sector, but that it is within government expectations. Ministers have dismissed claims that the tax policy was pricing parents out of their preferred schools, and said that VAT on fees was raising more than £1.5 billion a year that could be spent improving state schools. Since VAT on fees was introduced, there are 33,231 fewer private school pupils, a decline of 5.6%. More details and comment in the Financial Times. FE Week says hundreds of staff at Exam Board AQA will strike for 4 more days over an ongoing pay row. Around 400 members of Unison will strike again after AQA leaders refuse to meet for talks to discuss an alleged 10% cut to staff pay over the last 5 years. Unison is calling for pay restoration, requiring a 7.3% rise. AQA, however, issued what it described as a generous offer of 5.2%. The dispute could result in delays to exam results, although AQA says the 2026 series will be delivered smoothly. Finally, the BBC covers news that 9 children were taken to hospital after eating seeds from trees at a primary school in the East Midlands. The group of Year 6 children had eaten the seeds from the tree inside the school grounds and were taken to hospital as a precaution. They were all discharged after several hours and returned to school later in the week. The trees are going to be removed and pupils were given an assembly on the importance of safe play and the dangers of eating seeds and berries from trees and shrubs. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Thank you, Joe. Um, those poor kids. It's I'm kind of torn on that one with the children eating the seeds, because there is part of me thinking, yeah, children are children. That is something that that sounds right for an 11-year-old child to do. But then I'm also wondering how a child can get to this stage of year six and not had talks about not eating random stuff that you find out in nature. I'm all for like wild foraging and stuff like that, but you've got to make sure that you know what you're looking for. And surely one of the first things that you teach children when they're kind of 4 years old, and even sooner, from the moment they can start grabbing things, is don't pick something up from the floor and put it in your mouth. And that then kind of logically applies to stuff that comes from trees as we go through. Interesting. Interesting. Actually, as Joe was reading the news there, um, a couple of thoughts came to mind linked to our show topic today on observation. And that was, first of all, the news itself is a form of school observation. Where we at Teachers Talk Radio report on things that have been going in schools, where the BBC and Schools Week and ITV and whoever else report on things that have been happening in schools, that's a form of school observation. That's a school having what's going on in its grounds commented on, and then having to take action, which is kind of the point of observation as part of our performance management cycle, isn't it? We are observed. There are good things and flaws that are picked out, and we're expected to act on the flaws. It's a bizarre one, and I'm not sure how I feel about the tree being taken down, to be honest, because I think we already have enough destruction of nature around. One of the things that I love about primary schools kind of versus secondary, and I'm not in the habit of pitting primary and secondary against each other. I've worked in both, I continue to work in both, and I love both. But I've always, in all the primary schools that I have worked in, there has been a real kind of connection between the school building and the grounds that it sits on. And there has been that kind of, I don't know, synchronicity, I suppose, between the children and the nature that they're in. And so the idea of taking a tree down because some children ate some seeds from it, I don't think I like that. I also think it undermines the fact that they had an assembly on being safe, because I kind of feel like the lesson that the children are going to learn is you have to try and keep yourself safe by not doing these silly things. But it doesn't actually matter if you don't, because somebody else will come along and fix it for you anyway to make sure that that doesn't happen in future. And yeah, I don't know whether I think that's a good lesson or not. We'll see. Paul has messaged good morning to you to say, teacher's fault, obviously, of course, isn't it always? Lesson learned, I'd say. Now, I'm going to hold my hands up here and say, if I had been that teacher on playground duty that day, I 100% would have blamed myself for that. And I recognize how ridiculous that is, because, and please don't think that what I'm about to say is endorsing the idea that everybody should be out on playground duty all of the time. But the idea of having just one or two teachers out looking after the whole school on playground duty, and expecting us to be able to keep an eye on everybody at all times to make sure nothing bad happens ever, is unrealistic. And I logically, I know that. But I know, knowing me, I absolutely would have blamed myself for that happening. And again, it does make me wonder whether we need to kind of overhaul the pastoral provision that we have in schools. And I know there is no money for any of this, but as I've said before, one of the best ways that we can retain teachers is to reduce the amount of stuff that teachers have to do. If we can increase the number of non-teaching pastoral staff, teachers, if we can have 5 or 6 people who are employed and they go out on playground duty as part of their job, and as part of their job, they, I don't know, are the ones who understand the interventions, and they are the ones who take the registers, and they are the ones who are patrolling the corridors to make sure children are where they're supposed to be, then that would only benefit the children because there are more people looking after them, and it would benefit the teachers because there would be less on our plates. But yeah, that's not going to happen because we don't even have enough money for enough teaching staff, let alone other people. It wasn't the tree's fault, Paul. You are absolutely right. You are absolutely right. And yet the tree is the one being demolished. The tree is the one being taken down. So that's a big shame. A big shame. If you want to engage with the show, as Paul has done already today, you can. There are a couple of ways that you can do so. If you are listening live, either on YouTube or on X, then you can just drop me a message. I can read it. I can display it on screen. I love this about being on StreamYard at the moment, and we can engage that way. If you are listening in playback, then you can message me over on Blue Sky. I am at Mr. D Lester over there. That's MRDLESTER, and it's all one word. And we can engage that way because, as I always say, these things that I'm talking about are of perennial interest to me. See, I've gotten myself so worked up over that poor tree that I'm out of breath now. That is no good. That is no good. I very clearly am not the only person interested in this topic because about a month ago, Michelle did a show on the purpose of observation. And again, if you are watching live, I've just put a QR code up on the screen. If you scan that, that will take you over to Michelle's show so that you can give it a download, give it a listen if this is a topic that interests you. Again, please don't abandon me for a Michelle show. Please just, scan the QR code, hit pause, and then listen to that one when we are done here. But it is a really good one. It's a really interesting one on, again, the purpose of observation and what we get out of it. Because surely the whole point should be that we, as the teachers, get something out of it. And the fact is that we don't always. The fact is it can be a bit of a tick box exercise for senior leaders. They know that they have to perform the observation, and so they do. And then it's done, and you get your feedback, and everything is out of the way, which of course kind of, in my opinion, puts teachers under pressure for no good reason at that point. Paul has also said that he has been observed 3 times in the last week, all seen as a tick box activity by the staff monitoring for their subjects. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. This is a very common theme, I think. Again, I have been a primary subject leader. I was primary MFL and RE lead. I was in a slightly unusual situation in that I was the only MFL teacher. And so it was impossible for me to observe myself. So I actually asked my TA to observe me. In that case, I had a French-speaking TA who would come to some of my lessons. And so I just asked her to observe me for my monitoring on that one. But then, yeah, I absolutely, as RE lead, I didn't need to do as many observations as I might have done because we also had the diocese observation happening. And that kind of got wrapped up into what I was doing. But yeah, it absolutely can be a tick box exercise. And what I find particularly interesting about what Paul has said here is the number of times that he's been observed. because, and I promise, Paul and I have not planned his sequence of messages this morning. There is actually non-statutory guidance on the number of times that that one should be observed, and that number 3 is very, very important. In fact, let's go to that now and just see exactly what the unions have to say. So the NEU says there is no statutory limit on the number of teacher observations, but NEU policy is for a maximum of 3 per year for all purposes, not exceeding 3 hours in total. And this comes from what did used to be statutory guidance. It up until 2012, with the coalition government, this was actually enshrined in law that legally we could only be observed up to 3 times a year, not exceeding 3 hours. Coalition government got rid of the statute that included that, and so the NEU has kind of kept that as their non-statutory guidance. The NASUWT have something similar. They say there should be a limit of a total of 3 observations for all purposes. Under no circumstances shall the total time occupied by all observations exceed 3 hours per year. So both of the big educational unions in the UK have got that number of 3 being the total number of times you should be observed in a year. Now, it gets tricky, doesn't it? Because that is non-statutory guidance. It's not law. It's not something that schools have to adhere to. But I think if a school recognizes the presence of a union, and if a school is happy for its teachers to use a union for things like striking, for legal representation, for all of the kind of benefits that you get from being in a union, then a school should also adhere to the guidelines that it puts in place. And, you know, that's the 3 observations per year, not exceeding 3 hours, ought to be something that is followed, that is adhered to. I understand that it's a very tricky discussion to have. There is a reason that at no point in my career have I considered being a union rep, because those difficult conversations would not be easy for me. But I think it is important if a school recognizes unions, if it recognizes the authority and the power of unions, I do think it's important that that those kinds of rules are followed, are adhered to. What I also find really interesting is the idea of for all purposes. Because again, as teachers, even if we kind of ignore the kind of wider observations that I talked about before the news, there are lots of reasons for which we might be observed. If you've got an inspectorate coming in, if you've got Ofsted or ISI coming in to make judgments, then you are going to be observed. If you are in primary and you have got the heads of subjects doing their monitoring, you are going to be observed. And if that happens for every subject throughout the year, chances are you might, especially if you're in a small primary school, you might be called upon to be observed more than 3 times just for that purpose. You know, like Paul said, he's had 3 times this week alone, let alone whatever has come before. Then there is your own performance management, your own target setting. Then there are the times where you're sitting there reflecting on your own practice and thinking, oh, actually, things aren't going too well with my year 6 PE group. Maybe I need somebody to come and observe me so that I can see what I'm doing wrong. You know, how is it I'm giving my instructions? How is it I'm structuring my lessons where my lesson just isn't flowing the way that I want it to be? So when we ourselves trigger an observation because we want to improve our own practice, then there might be times where you are acting as a mentor. If your school has kind of adopted mentoring as CPD and you are mentoring another teacher, they might come and observe you doing whatever it is that you are mentoring them in. There are all sorts of ways that we are observed formally and professionally. And you can't, if we're sticking to that 3 observations per year limit, you can't have all of them. And then we've got the invention of learning walks, which has become a very interesting one, because learning walks seem to happen quite regularly, and there is separate guidance on learning walks, about how no individual teacher will be judged during a learning walk. It doesn't count towards our performance management cycle, all of that sort of thing. But there is actually no guidance that I could find, at least, talking about whether learning walks count towards our observation total, when I feel like they should. And back in the day, again, under that old legislation, there were things that did count as observations that kind of, I feel, were the precedent for learning walks. So I remember at one point quite early on in my career becoming quite concerned about the number of times the head teacher would walk past my classroom. Now, of course, I was an NQT, so I was expecting that people would keep an eye on me. But I also knew that this head teacher didn't like me very much, or at least I perceived that this head teacher didn't like me very much. And I noticed that she was walking past my classroom quite often. But it was a small school, and so I didn't really think very much of it until one day my TA pointed out that she was walking past the classroom quite a lot. And when I spoke to the union about it, I didn't go to the union to complain. I just kind of, as an NQT, I just wanted somebody to speak to about kind of what was going on, and was it okay that this was happening enough that my TA might comment on it. I was told that actually that should count as an observation. If she were walking past my classroom often enough that another adult was able to notice that it was happening and say, hold on, that's a little bit weird, then that should be an observation ticked off of my list, whether she meant it to be or not. And of course, again, that statute is now long gone. But that kind of predecessor of learning walks, the idea that a head teacher, a deputy head, a head of subject might walk past your room while you are teaching a specific subject and kind of make a judgment about you while you are doing it, that is that predecessor. And so I think it's interesting that we don't have that same kind of, as far as I could find at least, we don't have that same kind of guidance about whether or not learning walks are counting towards those 3 observations that we are given per year. And I understand why, because if we start being hard and fast with those rules, it does become very difficult for a school to kind of do its job. Because again, 3 observations is not very many. You can't, like I said, if you're only having 3, then in primary, you can only be observed delivering 3 subjects by those head of subjects, those subject leads. And that then is without you wanting to be observed for your own professional development or for any of the other myriad of reasons you might be observed. So we've got to be judicious, I think, with how we think about observation and what we think about observation. Now, in my previous brick and mortar school, I was very adamant about following the guidance because, again, my belief was that we use the union for positive things. We use the union for help when we need it. And it seemed wrong to me that we would kind of use them to help us kind of when we were actually in need of actual physical real help, and then not follow their guidance for other things just because it was inconvenient. I didn't like the hypocrisy of that. So yeah, I was very militant about no more than 3 observations per year, no more than 3 hours. And it will probably surprise a lot of my former colleagues to know that I actually don't mind being observed. I promise I was only so militant about it because I believe that if you're going to benefit from something, you've got to follow rules when they are put in place. But yeah, I personally don't mind being observed. I respond well to an audience, I suppose. I like when I have another adult in the room. I think it's fun when an adult comes into the room and you can kind of bring them in on the joke of whatever is going on in your class. One of my favorite observers ever was, well, actually, one of my favorite colleagues ever, to be fair. She was an amazing French teacher. She was the head of French at that point, and she and I would often team teach. And she came in to observe one of my year 9 lessons once, and just while the kids were working, and as we were going around, sort of checking what they were doing, we were just bantering with each other in French. We were just having a chat. We were just having a good time, having a laugh with each other. And I felt, and I know that she felt, because we had a conversation about it afterwards, that it was really important for us to demonstrate to the children that French wasn't just a language where you sat and you conjugated verbs, but it was a language where you could make friends and you could share jokes and you could laugh with each other. And the kids had a good time trying to figure out what we were talking about, whether we were talking about them. And it was just a really nice, a really lovely atmosphere. And so I do like it when observers come in and they get involved. I also like it when you have an idea for a lesson, something maybe a bit out of the box. Maybe you're doing an escape room, or maybe you are doing an RPG, or any of the big things, that the kind of real change from pedagogy that I've talked about before. And you have somebody come in and observe it, and then you get an outsider's opinion on sort of what it looked like, how it flowed, whether or not they felt it was pedagogically useful. I think with those things, you do have to kind of take the observation feedback with a bit of a pinch of salt, because obviously if you are doing something that is relatively new but is evidence-based, and you've got somebody coming in to observe it who hasn't read the evidence base, they may not understand your reasoning for doing it, which of course is why you have the conversation afterwards. And so, the feedback that you get from observation is only ever going to be as useful as how well informed the observer is about the lesson that you are delivering, which I suppose is why we should give really detailed lesson plans to somebody who is coming to observe us, but then that takes time. It all gets very complicated, doesn't it, when we start to pull apart the nitty-gritty of what an observation is, and how it happens, and what it looks like, and what the point is. Now, I'm not going to go into what the point is, because the show of Michelle's that I've got linked up there in the QR code, that talks about the point of observation. And I don't want to spend any more time talking over that, because we've kind of been through it a little bit. What I want to think about is the impact that observation has on our well-being, on teacher well-being, because as you know, if you've been a friend of the show for any kind of time, you will know there are kind of 3 big things that I am interested in. My research interests, if you like, can be encapsulated under language, culture, and teacher well-being. Those are my things. And so I want to think about teacher well-being, specifically teacher psychological well-being, in terms of observation. And that's where we're coming from today. So I've read a paper called Psychological Effects of Excessive Administrative Visits on Teachers' Performance. Now, this is an old paper because it's from the Bulletin of Education and Research in December 2016. So this is research that was conducted a long time ago. But if I think about like my own practice from 2016 until the last time I was in a brick and mortar school in 2025, not a lot has actually changed in terms of observation, in terms of how observations happen, the format of an observation, what they do. So I kind of feel like even though this is old research, it is still valid, it's still valuable. And as I was reading through it, I was thinking, yes, all of this is true, all of this is good. So we should never kind of dismiss research just because it's old. Of course, if it has been superseded by other research, then absolutely we should dismiss it. You know, no school these days should still be talking about VAC learning styles because that had already been superseded by better research when I started training as a teacher in 2004. So I kind of feel like, you know, there are times that we absolutely have to go, this research is too old. But if nothing kind of slots since, if there has been no big breakthrough since then, you know, there's nothing wrong with going back to something that is from 2016, 2006, 1996, whenever it might be. We're going to start our discussion of this paper, though, with a quote, because I think this quote really beautifully grounds the point of this research and something that I think can often be overlooked when we are talking about observation. And one of the teachers said, when they were interviewed, my colleagues and I work in a climate of fear. We see teachers crying in their cars, not able to come in for fear of the day ahead. Teachers are crying in corridors after years of successful teaching, demoralized and mystified by bad observation feedback. They are also crying over their loss of confidence and the loss of their joy of teaching.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
So these teachers who were being interviewed are all in Pakistan. That's where this piece of research comes from. And it's always interesting when you look at educational research in a worldwide perspective, I think, because education systems across the world are very different. But I do think it's very important for us to read and learn from research from across the world because children are generally very similar. The acts of learning are very similar. The acts of teaching might be different, but the act of learning is very similar. And so I think that we do have a lot to learn from each other. What is specifically interesting about a Pakistani context, though, is that it is still very much rooted in British colonialism. So as a teacher in England, I can look at research that is coming out of former British colonies, and I can look at sort of how much they have emulated the British system, albeit, you know, the British system from the 1850s or wherever it might have been, and then it's diverged since, but it's started in that same route. And so I think there is a lot of transferable information there. I think that there are a lot of similarities that really give credence to looking specifically at this type of research. And what is really interesting at the beginning of this paper is the historical observation that the researchers, Akhtar Ali, Nazreen Akhtar, Mohammed Ramzan, and Anfa Tabassum came out with. So they explained that the school inspection system in the Indo-Pakistan subcontinent was established during British colonial rule. And it came from the 1854 document that was called Wood's Dispatch. It was named after Sir Charles Wood, who was the Secretary of State for India at the time, and he outlined the aims and the structures of colonial education. And for him, inspection, that is the external monitoring of schools by government agents specifically, was really important, and it has been really important in an Indo-Pakistani school context ever since. So even though these countries have undergone independence, even though they are no longer governed by Britain, they still have these kind of remnants of British colonial legislation embedded within their school system. And the kind of Wood's Dispatch is one of them. So when we're thinking about, or when the researchers, are thinking about the point of observation, the point of inspection for them, it's important to keep in mind that the school inspection system was designed by and for a colonial administration. Its primary purpose was administrative control and accountability going upwards, so that things could be reported to authorities. It wasn't about improving teaching. It was about making sure that teachers were legible, I suppose, to the state. And I think, even though, of course, as Britain, we haven't been colonized since, the early 1000s, we do still have that idea of observation and inspection being a tool to make us legible to the state, to make sure that the government has an idea of what is going on in its schools. And we know that governments have agendas for their education policy. We know that political parties have very set ideas on what should and should not be taught in schools based on their own political ideologies. And inspection, observation can be, at its worst, one way of making sure that those things are happening. And I say at its worst, but it is something that happens. If you get an SMSC inspection that is focused on British values, that is the school being checked on whether or not it is doing what the government is saying should be done, teaching the values that a government is saying should be taught. And it just so happens that I would imagine the vast majority of us align with what was set out as the British values by the government at the time. And so we probably don't have a problem with that being inspected. Would we have a problem if a government whose values didn't align with our personal values telling us what we should be teaching, and then coming in and checking that that was the case? Now, obviously, that's not going to have to happen until a government that has opposing values to the vast majority of us takes power and starts imposing its values on the education system. But I think it is one thing for us to think about how observation is used, not just as a way of improving our teaching, not just for our own CPD, but also as a way of making sure that we are hitting those government objectives, and the extent to which we as teachers are happy to hit those government objectives. And if we're not, what does that mean for us, for our futures, for our careers? So yeah, that's my little spiel on that. But what I found really interesting, actually applying that kind of colonial context to the subject of observation, is that even though Britain was the colonizing country, our system of inspection still has that kind of colonial edge to it. It still has that reporting to the government reasoning. And you kind of have to think, how useful is that actually? And, there are many people who are willing to do shows to talk specifically about Ofsted, to talk about the ISI. That's sort of not why we're here, but it is interesting to think about that reasoning. That the reasoning is rooted in colonialism, and where we've had that big push for decolonizing curricula lately, no one seems to be talking about the idea of decolonizing the system, which would have to interrogate this idea of observation and judgment, because that's where it comes from. That's where it's rooted. The researchers kind of, when talking about the point of observation, they cite a line back from 1989 from a researcher called Beach, that says these monitoring activities are helpful for authorities to force teachers to go to class, but they are unable to compel them to teach. And so there's a lot of power that we have as teachers. This is what I'm taking from that line. And it's important for us to remember our power when we are being observed. That yes, we can go into our classroom, but we don't have to teach anything. We would fail the observation if we didn't. We might rightfully have our pay withheld if we didn't. But being observed alone cannot compel us to do our teaching. And I think that we need to retain that. I think we need to remember that. I think we need to not rebel and not go, no, I'm refusing to teach until you leave my classroom. I don't think that's the way to go at all. I think we can use what Beach wrote as a way of reminding ourselves that observations should be for our benefit. They shouldn't be a tick box exercise so that a head of subject, head of department can say that they have done their job properly. They shouldn't be something that is done and then written up and then filed away in a drawer, never to be looked at again. They should be for our own improvement. They should be for our benefit. Observations should exist for the teacher, not for the observer. But the flip side of that comes from a conversation that I had with somebody recently who made a really good point that, having been in both positions, this person felt that she actually benefited more being the observer than she did being the person who was observed. She felt like when she was being observed, it was a tick box exercise, that the observer had come in to do it because they had to. She had to come up with performance management targets, and it was just an extra layer of bureaucracy. But when she went to observe, she could see excellent practice, and she could see what a teacher did, how a teacher phrased something, how they sequenced the lesson so that it went well. She could see the inverse. If a lesson went wrong, she could see why it went wrong, what the teacher did, what a student did that derailed the lesson, and how the teacher either did or did not respond to it. And there's a lot there that you can take back into your own practice. Do we remember Teachers TV from back in the day? I think one of the worst things that has happened to British education has been the loss of Teachers TV. Because I remember training and I would just have it on in the background. And it was amazing because you would see all of these lessons happening in these programs that were being put on. And it kind of acted like an observation, but in that way that the person I was speaking to framed it, that I was the observer watching these lessons happening. but they weren't for the benefit of the person being observed, because this was on TV. I didn't know who that teacher was. I had no way of getting in touch with them to tell them what I thought. And why would they care what I thought? I was just a trainee sitting at home watching while I was writing my assignment. But it was brilliant because I got to see so many lessons in action, and I got to pick the lessons apart and figure them out and work out whether specific activities, whether specific ideas would or would not work for me. And so I think if an observation is done well and it's done properly and it's done for the right reasons, then it can be valid very much for the observer. Even if you are observing somebody that you are line managing, even if you are observing somebody that you have 20 years on, you can still learn things from watching them. For good or for bad, you can still learn things. But it should also be for the benefit of the person being observed. And the kind of theory behind observation, what we're supposed to do when we're preparing for observation, does acknowledge that. You know, the fact that we are supposed to have a specific focus, I forgot the word, for the observation. The fact that, you know, we want our observer to come in and look at one or two things that we either want help with, improvement on, or to showcase, or to see whether we have improved on something. But I don't know about you, but I always wasted those opportunities, quite honestly. And I regret it looking back, because I feel like I had a great many opportunities to sort of improve my own practice if I had taken that part of the observation seriously. And if I had said, no, actually, as part of my own practice, please, can you come and watch me do X, because that's what I want to get better at. But instead, I, as the person being observed, saw it as a tick box exercise. I knew that my observer had to come and watch me as part of their job. And I kind of framed it, I guess, in my head as being very altruistic. I was a good team player because I was letting them come to observe me so that they could tell their line managers that they had done their job properly. Aren't I great? Whereas in fact, if I had taken it a bit more seriously and I had used it as an opportunity for reflection on my own practice, I probably could have learned so much more from it than I ever did. I ever have done up until this point. And you know, it's not too late. I would say I'm probably about halfway through my teaching career now, 19, 20 years in. I've probably got about another 20, no, more than that. I'm not even halfway through yet. So I've got a lot of time still to learn from observation. But it's about kind of making sure that I'm very clear with myself, that we are all very clear with ourselves about how observation fits into our own CPD, our own professional development, our own journeys as teachers, and making sure that we can really profit from it, that we can really make the most of it. But kind of going back to the point of this paper, we've got what we call the paradox of performative accountability, which I really love as a kind of concept. And this is kind of what I was just talking about, that difference between compliance and performance. Compliance is doing what you know you are expected to do when someone is watching you. Performance, and that's when you are going that little bit deeper. That's when you are doing your job as an excellent teacher. And again, that takes some interrogation during the observation setup process. Are you complying to the observation, which is pretty much what I've done my whole career? I'm going to hold my hands up now and say that. I say so many things on this show that paint me in a bad light. I promise, I think I'm a good teacher. But yeah, are we doing it because we know it's a tick box exercise? We know that our colleague who we happen to like has to come and observe us, and so, we allow that? Or are we doing it because we want to show our teaching skills, because we want to learn more about ourselves as a teacher, and because having somebody else come and watch us is actually much less embarrassing than that fad from a couple of years ago of videotaping yourself teaching and having to watch back your own lesson? Um, and that's kind of where that inspection paradigm comes into play, isn't it? Because the inspection paradigm is very much compliant, because we know that big things rest on inspection results. Whether we believe they should or not, whether we want them to or not, we know that they do. We know that inspection results are published, they are widely published. We know that parents make decisions based on them. We know that, rightly or wrongly, they are important. And so we might comply in that case. We might do exactly what we know we're supposed to do. We might have read other Ofsted reports, found what inspectors like, and do those things instead of performing at our best as teachers. Because maybe there is discrepancy between what inspectorates are looking for and what we actually do. And that then is another conversation about whether or not one party is right. Should there be a discrepancy between what inspectorates are looking for and what teachers actually do? But the inspection paradigm in its most coercive form is optimized for that compliance. And when you optimize the system for compliance, then you get compliance. You don't necessarily get great teaching. You don't necessarily get teachers who are actually seeking feedback on their learning, on their teaching, in order to learn, in order to improve. You get teachers, ironically enough, given the compliance performance paradigm that we've set up, you get teachers performing what they think the inspector wants to see in terms of good teachers, so that we get a good grade. Let's be honest. Let's just strip back all of the fluff. Quite often, when we are being observed, we're aiming for that outstanding. That's the box that we want ticked. Because we don't actually want a piece of paper that goes in our file that says we are satisfactory at something, because we all want to be really, really good. We all want to excel. And so it can be quite scary when you get that good, or the satisfactory, or the requires improvement ticked on your form. It can be quite scary to ask for the things that you know need work to come and be observed, because that's going to be the tick that goes on your form. Because we are those high achieving perfectionist kids who want the grade 9, who want the grade A star, and who get really stressed if it's a grade 8 or an A. So there is a lot to be said for compliance versus performance, from doing what you know is going to get a good grade and is going to go in your file, and you can then whip out at a job interview, or look at my most recent observation where I was judged outstanding in all areas, because that might help you get the promotion. It might help you to get the next job, but it doesn't help you to improve as a teacher. And again, maybe this is where, as individuals, we need to be a bit more deliberate about how we're using observation and why we're asking to be observed. Maybe if you need an observation to take with you to an interview, then yes, you ask if somebody can come and observe you teach an outstanding lesson with a class that you know is always going to be outstanding, so that you get those boxes ticked. Maybe if you are going through a bit of a rough patch with your year 8 life skills class, and you want to make improvements to that, you prepare yourself for having good or satisfactory ticked on the observation form, and you then ask somebody to come in and observe that lesson as a learning exercise, as a way of improving your own teaching. I think if we are all, both observers and observees, much more deliberate about why we're going through the process, then it can be less stressful and more useful for everybody. The research paper describes administrative visits as having 3 very distinct psychological phases: the before, the during, and the after. And again, I think that this is universal. I don't think that this is just to do with the Pakistani context, and I don't think it's just to do with government inspection. I think that this is true of any time that we are observed. So before the visit, if it's planned, then the anticipation begins immediately. And we've all felt that when we've had the email come round, or it's been announced at the staff meeting, oh, it's time for your observation, oh, we're doing a learning walk this week, you begin to think about it. Your brain begins to process it. You begin to, whether consciously or subconsciously, you begin to make plans for it. There's a kind of institutional anxiety that begins to take hold, either within just your classroom, because maybe you know that they're going to come to your badly behaved year 8s, and so you start to prep them for that. And the children kind of pick up on your anxiety, they pick up on your worry. Maybe at a departmental level, because the learning walk is coming round and you know that you've been excellent as a department this term, and you want the deputy head who's performing the learning walk to see that. Maybe at a school level, because it's Ofsted, it's ISI, it's the diocese, they're the ones coming in, it's going to be a whole school judgment. Whatever it is, at any level of institution, there is that anxiety of this thing is going to happen, these judgments are going to be made. The researchers actually noted that newly appointed teachers tend to be more confused and more anxious about observational visits than experienced staff, because they haven't yet developed strategies for managing that judgment, for managing those encounters. They often feel less confident about the curriculum they're delivering, about the reasons why they are delivering lessons in certain ways, and they are less practiced at navigating the politics of being observed. And it's those politics that I think are really interesting. For all the reasons that we have talked about today, observation is a political exercise. Whether we want to admit it or not, the idea that we are going to be observed by somebody who is, on paper, further along in their career than we are, who, is in a job where they are deemed capable of coming to judge our teaching, whatever it might be. There are certain assumptions that are made, there are certain politics that are played through observation that it is very important to be mindful of, because those politics can quite often cloud how you see something. If you don't like the person who is coming to judge you, if on a personal level you are not a fan of your head of department, and they're the ones coming to observe you, you might feel, rightly or wrongly, because it could go either way, that your observation is harsher than it needs to be, than it should have been. You might feel that it's unfair. And that's just the nature, I suppose, of human relationships, isn't it? We like some people, we dislike other people. We're not always going to like the people who are higher up the ladder than we are, whose job it is to come and judge us. So it is really important, again, for our own well-being, for our safeguarding of ourselves, to be aware of the politics that are at play, to be aware of our own feelings towards the person who is coming to observe us, and to understand that that's the lens through which we are receiving our feedback. That's also why you might ask for your teacher BFF to come and observe you. Not because you think that they are necessarily going to be nicer about it, not because you think they're going to be the ones that tick outstanding on all of your boxes, but just because you have that relationship built with them, and you are more likely to take their advice, their feedback on board because you trust them, because you like them, because through that relationship, you feel like they absolutely have your best interests at heart. So that might be something to consider, especially when you are doing relationships, observations for your own professional development. Think about who you're asking to come and observe you. Think about the skills that they have that kind of warrant them coming to observe you. What do you respect about their practice, so that when they give you the feedback, you will actually take that on board and go, yes, this person knows what they're talking about, and so that feedback is valid. Kind of pick a person so that you don't have any kind of mental reason to go, oh, okay, well, I'm going to ignore that because they just don't like me, or they don't know what they're talking about, or any of those kind of negative lenses through which we can observe the feedback that we receive. When we get a surprise visit, so when it's an unannounced learning walk, when it's an unannounced inspection, the anxiety itself isn't anticipatory. It can't be because it's unannounced, but it is still pervasive, so it does still exist. If you know that a visit could come at any time, you are always on the alert. And this is why things like the head teacher walking back and forth past your classroom can be very unnerving, and it can be very stressful, because even if something like that is not supposed to be an observation, as the teacher, you are aware that they're going to hear what's going on in your classroom. They're going to hear whether you're having a good day or a bad day. And whether they mean to or not, they're going to make judgments about it. And when you are aware of those things happening, it is really hard to kind of turn that anxiety off. And it's a really odd thing because schools are quite small. Classrooms are packed closely together. We've all been next door to that particularly noisy class when we've been trying to get our class to do a test. So we know, we've also all been the teacher of that noisy class trying to keep them quiet when we know the class next door is trying to do a test, let's be honest. So we kind of know that the teachers around us are able to hear what's going on. And again, are maybe going to comment on it, maybe make judgments about it, whether on a personal or a professional level. I know that I've done it. I've walked past classrooms before, and I've kind of stopped at the door because I found the stuff that was being taught, the lesson being delivered, so engaging that I lost myself for a second in that lesson, and I just kind of wanted to be in the class and watching it. And I know that I shouldn't have done that, because I know that the teacher delivering the lesson didn't necessarily know what my intentions were. They didn't know that I was enthralled by their teaching. And I know that that could have heightened their anxiety. I did make sure on at least 2 occasions that that's happened. I have made sure that I've tracked down the teacher afterwards and explained. But that doesn't kind of take away from the fact that in that moment, when somebody just randomly arrives when you're teaching, there is that spiked anxiety, because all of a sudden you are aware of somebody else watching your teaching, possibly making judgments about it, and you don't know whether those judgments are going to be positive or negative. During the actual inspection, so in that during phase, the researchers describe a range of psychological reactions. Some teachers report being completely unaffected by the presence of observers. Some teachers just don't care that there is an observer in their room. They will carry on doing their lesson as it was planned, and it's just going to happen. Others experience varying degrees of panic. They experience hesitation in lesson delivery. That's particularly true in new teachers. They sort of stumble over the sequence. They become hesitant at giving instructions. there is a specific anxiety about not knowing what feedback is going to come at the end that has been reported, about not knowing whether a lesson has gone well or not, and about not knowing if an observer thinks a lesson has gone well, even if you think it has. Because again, we all have different expectations. We all have different levels of what is a good lesson, what is a poor lesson. The thing that you were most proud of in that lesson might have been completely unnoticed by your observer, unless it had been picked out as a focus. And again, I think if we are more deliberate about our observations, and if we treat them less of that tick box exercise that I described, that Paul mentioned earlier, and we are very focused on this is what we want to see, this is what we want to see if there has been progress in, this is what we want to get out of it, and we kind of have an observation outcomes box. By the end of this observation, I will, at least then, there will be less anxiety about the feedback that's coming at the end, because you will know what they're going to talk about. You will know what they're going to comment on, and you can prepare for that. If you've been watched for an hour and absolutely anything that you have done could be commented on because you haven't agreed a focus, then that's going to increase that anxiety. So all of these things that look like they are just paperwork, that can be just treated as tick boxes, like find a focus. And the number of times I have said to observers, oh, I don't mind what you focus on, just, you decide what you would like to focus on, and I'll make sure that we deliver that in the lesson. I got that completely backwards, because it should have been about what I wanted the focus to be. It should have been about what I wanted to either show off or to improve on. And I knew that I had anxiety going into that feedback every single time. It just never occurred to me, literally until I read this paper, that a lot of that anxiety was because I didn't really do my bit in deciding what the focus of the observation was going to be. I let it be too broad. I let myself go into this observation blind, because I saw it as me helping out my head of department do their job, instead of their job being to help me. And I had framed it completely wrong. While talking about what happens during the observation, the paper makes a really pointed observation when it says that the significant source of anxiety is not always the actual observation. Again, we're teachers. We are used to eyes being on us. It's what we do for millions of hours every single day. But it's the feedback or the lack thereof afterwards. Teachers have been observed. They might be found wanting in some way, but they're never told how. The visit has happened, the evaluative gaze has come down on them, and then it left without any kind of explanation. Now, again, in England, at least, the unions do have protocols around this. So they say that verbal feedback should occur within 24 hours of the observation during directed time. And those rules are there to help to kind of minimize this anxiety, so that you are not waiting forever. But at the same time, those of us who are observing, even if it seems like the person that we are observing is completely unaffected by our presence, if we know that we're not going to deliver the verbal feedback until the next day, just a quick 2 minutes, thank you, that was really, really good. We'll talk about it tomorrow, but honestly, you've got nothing to worry about. Or we agreed that we would talk about behavior management. There are a couple of issues with this child and this child. I'm going to go away and read some books on it overnight, and then tomorrow we'll sit down and we'll come up with some strategies. And just kind of giving a very quick, formative, this is what we're going to talk about. It could be helpful. It could also trigger anxiety, I suppose. So it is important to understand the person that you are talking to, but I think it could go a long way towards minimizing that anxiety as well. What I found most telling about this research, though, was the after the visit effect, because negative observations in this study report a reduced amount of professional efficiency. Now, this is slightly where Pakistan's specific context comes into play, because they have a PEEDA Act, the Punjab Employees Efficiency, Discipline and Accountability Act. And basically that means that if a teacher receives poor observations, then they are at risk of disciplinary action. And that's not something that we are necessarily faced with in England, because, you know, if you have a poor observation, then what you do is you pick out what it was that went badly in that lesson. You make that then a priority for immediate action, and you ask to be reobserved at some time later, a few days, a week, a couple of weeks, whenever, but just to kind of make sure that you are back on track with that. Unless something kind of illegal happens, it's highly unlikely that your job will be at risk after an observation here. But there is still that feeling that you can get where if you are judged and you are found to be inadequate, again, especially if a lot of your own identity is wrapped up in being a teacher, you can begin to doubt yourself. You can begin to completely undermine everything you thought you knew about your own pedagogy, about your own teaching. And you can start to lose that kind of efficiency, that efficacy in yourself as a teacher that has made you a good teacher to begin with. And the paper kind of notes explicitly that teachers in Pakistan have no authority to challenge the findings after an inspection report. Again, after an Ofsted and ISI inspection here, you do have the opportunity to challenge, you do have the opportunity to offer feedback on the inspection process. So this is, again, a country-specific case. But if you've been taken aback because you thought an observation went really, really well, and then all of the feedback that you get from your observer is negative, I'm not sure if in that moment you are going to be able to challenge it, because it will come as a shock, because it's not what you were expecting. And then, of course, you have that feedback and the bell rings, and immediately you've got to go into a lesson because there are children who are waiting for you, and you've got to deliver a lesson, even though all of a sudden maybe you feel like you are not the good teacher you thought you were when you went into work that morning. So as we kind of draw the show to a close, we need to think about the 5 kind of psychological effects that observation have, and reflect on what we've talked about over the past hour on how perhaps being a bit more mindful of our own observation and being a bit more proactive in our own observation process can maybe help us psychologically to deal with this idea that we are perpetually being observed.
This show is brought to you in partnership with Hachette Learning, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Level up your professional development today and visit hachetlearning.com to explore the full range of titles.
So this study kind of, like I said, breaks down into 5 kind of conclusive statements that are really important for us to keep in mind when we are planning observations, when we are thinking about observations, when we are thinking about being observed. Statement number 1, anxiety is increased due to administrative visits. Whether a teacher wants to admit it or not, whether a teacher even recognizes it or not, in general, we do feel anxious when we are being observed. There is a lot to be said for, oh, well, we know it's coming, we know it happens 3 times a year, we'll just power through. And that would be fine if being observed were the only thing that we were powering through. But as it is, there's a lot of stuff that can make a teacher anxious. And so we do have to keep in mind that kind of very delicate balancing act, that kind of buckaroo style. Is this going to be the thing that causes the teacher to kick? Is this going to be the thing that pushes the teacher over the edge? And we've got to be very aware of that within our own practice, within our own selves, within our own bodies. Mental stress does occur during observation. Again, as teachers, we should understand that, because we should understand that having a colleague in our classroom adds to cognitive load, if nothing else, because you've had to think about making sure all the paperwork is done for them, making sure that they have somewhere to sit, making sure that the class is prepped. There has been all of that kind of additional load onto this one lesson, irrespective of how we feel about being judged. So we are already under more mental stress because we have a diminished cognitive load capacity to play with, which also explains why we can feel so emotional about being observed, why it can feel that much more stressful, because it's one extra thing to think about. The third thing that they concluded was that teachers become embarrassed when they are asked questions about their own class management and professional skills. Now, this is not all teachers. This was actually about half of them, just over half of the teachers reported embarrassment when being questioned about their class management. But I think this is where stronger CPD needs to come into play. And again, where we all need to be very deliberate about all of our practices. Because if you have an answer for that question, Susie was talking during your whole class teaching and you didn't challenge it. Why did you choose not to do that? If you've got an answer for that, oh, because the latest research says, oh, because Susie's healthcare plan says, then again, it's going to be much less stressful for you than if you were to say, oh, I just didn't notice. Or, oh, Susie's always talking, that's just the way she is. I mean, if you didn't notice, then fair enough. And that's, feedback that you can take on board. That's something that you can think about. But if we make sure that everything we do in our classroom is done deliberately and is evidence informed, is research based, even down to how we challenge a child about talking when we're talking, then we're going to have an answer to that question when we're asked why we did or didn't do something. And it feels a lot less judgmental if you can say, oh, well, the evidence says, oh, well, the paper by so-and-so says, as opposed to, oh, I made a judgment call. And sometimes we like, oh, I made a judgment call, because it makes us feel good. If the observer liked what we did and we just say, oh, it was my instinct, oh, it's what I always do, that makes us feel great as teachers. But the inverse is always true. If we can't justify it, if our judgment call was wrong, then it makes us feel worse. So be very deliberate in all of your practices. Know why you do everything that you do, and have the evidence ready to present for that. Around the same number of teachers who are embarrassed about talking about their class management or professional skills are also hesitant when delivering the lesson in the presence of an observer. So again, slightly over half of the number of teachers reported that having observers in the room made them more hesitant in their own teaching. The act of being watched changed how they performed, and it's not for the better. And this is important for the observer to keep in mind, that what you are seeing is never going to be an actual classroom dynamic, because the dynamic of that classroom is changed by your presence there. The children are acting differently. The teacher is acting differently. You, as the observer, are disrupting that ecosystem. And I think it's okay to say that. I think if you are the one who is being observed, it is okay to point out that the class doesn't normally behave like that, and you think that maybe it was wrong to bring an observer into that lesson because it disrupted their routine, and they're not a class that is good with having their routine disrupted. And finally, around 60% of the teachers who were observed in this study reported being scared of their jobs being at risk as the result of a poor observation. And again, that's not necessarily something that we have to worry about in the UK, but I think we still do. I think whenever your boss comes to observe you, whenever somebody higher up than you comes to observe you, there is always that slight worry of, do I still belong here? Have I been here too long? Is it time to move on? Are they going to use this as a reason for X, Y, and Z? And it shouldn't be that way. But the research points out to the fact that it is. And so, to answer the kind of topic question today, how much observation is too much? The honest answer is any. Any observation is too much, because we take so many negatives from it, because there is so much mental load that is given towards getting through the observation and dealing with the aftermath. Observation is not going to go away. So what we need to do as a profession, but more importantly as individuals, is make sure that we understand the point of observation and that we are benefiting from them. Because I think if you can frame it in a way that you are getting something out of being observed, that it isn't some kind of, you being altruistic, then at least even if the feedback isn't great, you can say that you've learned something. So that's it for this morning. Thank you all very much for joining me. I hope that you have enjoyed the show. I hope you have been able to take something away from it. There is no show next Saturday, just so as you are aware. I'm in Birmingham giving a talk to primary school teachers. So I am away next weekend. So I will see you in 2 weeks' time. And that show is going to be about, he says, trying to find his notebook. Oh, violence and bullying in schools. So yeah, there's a really interesting report that has come out of Germany looking at violence in schools and bullying in schools. So we're going to kind of unpick that one together. But yeah, I hope that you all have a great 2 weeks. If you happen to be at the event that I'm speaking at next week, please come and say hi. Let me know that you are there. But yeah, if I don't see you before then, I will see you in 2 weeks' time for Saturday breakfast. Have a great fortnight. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.